Nixon, meanwhile, was taking on the civil rights portfolio of the administration. Dulles had sent him to the Gold Coast, which became Ghana, for their independence ceremonies, and that's where he met Martin Luther King Jr. And they hit it off. And King had been trying to see Nixon anyway, and they hit it off. And Nixon said, "Let's come meet me in Washington. We'll come to my office." And they had like a long session together. They wrote to each other. They stayed in touch, and King was very impressed by Nixon. And Nixon, in the summer of '57, a couple of months after the trip, the administration supported what at the time was a landmark civil rights bill, and Nixon took the administration's view. Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson are given credit for getting the bill passed, and of course they did because they were in Congress. But the bill was a weaker bill than the administration wanted. There was a particular provision, the voting rights section of the bill, and this gets very complicated, but basically, Johnson was playing all kinds of. By this time, he sort of saw himself running for president. He had to appeal to the northern liberal Democrats, but he didn't want to lose the southern conservatives like Richard Russell. And the voting rights section would say that yes, if any violation of voting rights would then be subject to a jury trial, and everyone knew this was ridiculous. A jury trial of the South on a voting rights thing was like an instant nullification. And thanks to the administration, the Eisenhower administration, and Nixon carried it through, they made it a slightly stronger bill, and it said that a judge could impose a fine and some jail time for any violation of this voting rights thing. And Nixon got huge thanks from Dr. King, from Jackie Robinson, who was actually a friend of his and had been a supporter and a friend of his since the 1952 convention, when Nixon saw him in the corridor and said, I remember when you were playing football at UCLA. I'll never forget a play you made, and that really impressed Jackie Robinson. And Nixon was a real sports fan. So and then 1960 began to approach, and probably the most devastating thing Eisenhower ever said about him was in late summer of 1960. Someone had asked Eisenhower. By this time Nixon was speaking of the Eisenhower-Nixon administration, which really annoyed Eisenhower because, and someone asked him, well, can you think of one major contribution that Vice President Nixon has made to your administration? And Eisenhower said, if you give me a week, I might think of one. And it was devastating to Nixon. I mean, Eisenhower claimed he didn't mean it. It came out wrong. He was being facetious. But it never went away. And Kennedy used it against him in the campaign. The reporters, of course, who were all in love with Kennedy, managed to repeat it, and it was devastating. The most devastating thing of all for Nixon, by the way, was an act of cowardice when Dr. King was arrested on a totally trumped-up charge and put in a paddy wagon and in chains to be taken to Reedsville Prison in Georgia. Coretta Scott King called both campaigns, the Kennedy campaign and the Nixon campaign, said, "Would you please help get him out?" There was the violence against African Americans in the South in Georgia at that time was horrible, and she really thought he was going to be killed. And the Kennedy people stepped up, and Nixon told his advisors that would just be grandstanding to interfere with the legal process. And King, that was it. King later said he had we were in touch. I thought we were friends, and it showed a real moral lapse. And if Nixon had done it, Kennedy was sent. By the way, the Kennedy people sent out a campaign flyer that said no comment, Nixon versus the candidate with a heart, and if Nixon had carried the black vote, and by the way, he still got 32% of the black vote, unlike today when Republicans get like 2% of the black vote, but he would have won. He probably would have won at least two more states, and everything would have changed.
A statement from a former aide to President Richard Nixon has just resurfaced. It definitely pulls back the curtain on the real motivation of the United States war on drugs, or at least it claims to. Many have thought this for a long time, but during an interview with a journalist in the mid-1990s, John Ehrlichman, Nixon's chief domestic advisor, when the war on drugs was actually announced, basically admitted that it was all an excuse to incarcerate African Americans as well as the anti-war left in this country. So let me read this quote to you before we get into it anymore. He said, quote, "You want to know what this was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Wow. So a very, very, very strong quote that could not be more relevant today in 2016, given the climate that we're in. But a lot of people are also kind of saying, well, that doesn't sound like something he would say. We have to remember that Dan Baum, the journalist who released this quote, who did the interview with him while he was writing a book, he did release it in a book back in 2012. Is this thing on? No one really talked about it. So now it just resurfaced in a magazine recently. And so now everyone seems to be talking about this. So it's like whether or not this happened, this man has been dead for quite a few years.
Died in 1999.
It's a long time ago. Why is it all coming out now? People are saying, we want to hear the tapes. But at the same time, though, I don't know. Could you put it past him?
It sounds like it could be true. I'm one of those people that says, let me hear the tapes, let me see the hard copy, and then maybe, you know, it fits too easily into what we know now. I don't see a top Nixon aide ever saying something like this. We're talking about a man who was arguably the scapegoat for Watergate. He spent 18 months in a federal corrections institution. He died of diabetes in '99. I don't know. I mean, it's a sexy story. We want to believe this, but I'd like to hear a tape of it.
Yeah. You know, to give some points on why it could possibly be true. I mean, he was a little bit older. He had time to reflect. He was far removed from the heat of the moment. This is decades on that he comes out and he starts speaking like this.
He wouldn't be an idiot, though, just because he's aging. I mean, he was 69.
I'm not saying he's an idiot for. I'm just saying maybe he was more upfront about it and wasn't in the heat of the moment, right? He wasn't in office. He'd already been in jail for 18 months, right? So maybe he was just letting it off of his conscience. But like you said, there are no tapes of it. So it's like, how are you going to know these things are true or not? But like I said, I mean, look, it couldn't be more relevant today. In other words, what he's saying is the intense racial targeting that we see is that's kind of become synonymous with the war on drugs in this country. It's not an unintended side effect. And that is something that we talk a lot about, especially in the wake of, you know, different events happening in Ferguson, for example, in the probing of the police departments in cities like Ferguson and Chicago. The amount of corruption, the targeting of minorities and people living in lower income communities to make up for the city's deficits.
There's no question that happens.
Hitting them with small, stupid things like marijuana, for example, more so than any other race, right? For example, if you look at African Americans in certain places like Ferguson, it's so unbalanced that it's not even funny. So you can't deny those things are happening.
Oh, I'm absolutely not denying those at all. I think that they absolutely do.
I just wouldn't put it past this country to tie it to something that was institutionalized, is all I'm saying.
Look, the 1960s were a really complicated time in American history, and it's entirely plausible that given the issues of race happening in the country at that time, given a very unpopular war that had been pretty well publicized, and you had major movements coming out speaking against this war, primarily with hippies and beatniks, and targeting specific groups because of drug use to get rid of them politically, that would make total sense. What doesn't make sense is that some guy would have a deathbed confession or a later in life confession, you know, making the career of a journalist, supposedly. You know, you and I in this work, we would kill for sources like this. A first-hand source saying something this salacious, are you kidding? Just from our experience, though, we know that rarely happens.
Such a hot quote. So why would he keep it under wraps for so long and then release it in a book just silently and then re-release it years later? That is kind of suspicious. You're right. But would you put it past the U.S. government to do something like that? Let us know in the comments.
In 1986, when I was coming of age, Ronald Reagan doubled down on the war on drugs that had been started by Richard Nixon in 1971. Drugs were bad, fried your brain, and drug dealers were monsters. The sole reason neighborhoods and major cities were failing. No one wanted to talk about Reaganomics and the ending of social safety nets, the defunding of schools and the loss of jobs in cities across America. Young men like me who hustled became the sole villain, and drug addicts lacked moral fortitude. In the 1990s, incarceration rates in the U.S. blew up. Today we imprison more people than any other country in the world. China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. All countries we consider autocratic and repressive. Yeah, more than them. Judges' hands were tied by tough on crime laws, and they were forced to hand out mandatory life sentences for simple possession and low-level drug sales. My home state of New York started this with Rockefeller laws. Then the feds made distinctions between people who sold powder cocaine and crack cocaine even though they were the same drug. Only difference is how you take it. And even though white people used and sold crack more than black people, somehow it was black people who went to prison. The media ignored actual data to this day. Crack is still talked about as a black problem. The NYPD raided our Brooklyn neighborhoods while Manhattan bankers openly used coke with impunity. The war on drugs exploded the U.S. prison population, disproportionately locking away black and Latinos. Our prison population grew more than 900%. When the war on drugs began in 1971, our prison population was 200,000. Today it is over 2 million. Long after the crack era ended, we continued our war on drugs. There were more than 1.5 million drug arrests in 2014. More than 80% were for possession only. Almost half were for marijuana. People are finally talking about treating addiction to harder drugs as a health crisis. But there's no compassionate language about drug dealers. Unless, of course, we're talking about places like Colorado, whose state economy got a huge boost by the above-ground marijuana industry. A few states south in Louisiana, they're still handing out mandatory sentences for people who sell weed. Despite a booming and celebrated $50 billion legal marijuana industry, most states still disproportionately hand out mandatory sentences to black and Latinos with drug cases. If you're entrepreneurial and live in one of the many states that are passing legalized laws, you may still face barriers participating in the above-ground economy. Venture capitalists migrate to these states to open multi-billion-dollar operations, but former felons can't open a dispensary. Lots of times those felonies were drug charges, caught by poor people who sold drugs for a living, but are now prohibited from participating in one of the fastest-growing economies. Got it? In states like New York, where holding marijuana is no longer grounds for arrest, police issue possession citations in black and Latino neighborhoods at a far higher rate than other neighborhoods. Kids in Crown Heights are constantly stopped and ticketed for trees. Kids at dorms in Columbia, where rates of marijuana use are equal to or worse than those in the hood, are never targeted or ticketed. Rates of drug use are as high as they were when Nixon declared this so-called war in 1971. 45 years later, it's time to rethink our policies and laws. The war on drugs is an epic fail.
We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America. Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us. We were brought here against our will. We were not brought here to be made citizens. We were not brought here to enjoy the constitutional gifts that they speak so beautifully about today. And because we weren't brought here to be made citizens today, now that we've become awakened to some degree and we begin to ask for those things which they say are supposedly for Americans, they look upon us with hostility and unfriendliness. If you're interested in freedom, you need some judo, you need some karate, you need all the things that will help you fight for freedom. Nationalism is the wave of the present and the future. It is nationalism that's bringing freedom to oppressed people all over the world. It was nationalism that brought freedom to the Algerians. It was nationalism that brought freedom to the Nigerians and to the Ghanaians. It was nationalism that brought freedom to the people of Uganda and Tanganyika and Sudan and Somaliland. The Africans didn't get it by sitting in. They didn't get it by waiting in. They didn't get it by singing "We Shall Overcome." They got it through nationalism. And you and I will get it through nationalism. What is it? What is it that makes it difficult for the philosophy of nationalism to spread among the so-called Negroes? Number one, they think they have a stake in America. They think they have an investment in this country, which we do. We invested 310 years of slave labor, 310 years, every day of which your and my mother and father worked for nothing. Not 8 hours a day. There was no union in that day. They worked from sun up until sundown, from can't see in the morning until can't see at night. They never had a day off. And on Sunday, they were allowed to sit down and sing about when they die, they wouldn't be slaves no more. When they die, they wouldn't be slaves no more. They'd go up in the sky, and every day would be Sunday. That's a shame. And it is that 310 years of slave labor that went in, that was my and your contribution into this particular economy and political system. They can give us the back pay. Let's join in. If this is what the Negro wants, let's join him. Let's show him how to struggle. Let's show him how to fight. Let's show him how to bring about a real revolution. Let's make him stop jiving. You don't need a debate. You don't need a filibuster. You need some action.